Good, we're on. Dear colleagues, thank you for taking your seats. Welcome to the open panel of the Riga Dialogue. We have had for 1.5 days quite intensive, very good discussions with a lot of conclusions. Some of them are going to be spilling into the public panel as well, I'm sure about it. And I'm very happy to see all of you in such great numbers coming over and listening in. We have very many people. First of all, this panel has multiple titles. We were wondering how to call it, so we came up with several versions of that. But the core idea is why Russia hasn't collapsed yet. Now, somewhat in 2022, I am that old that I remember that in 2022, it was so many politicians, the European Commission, and everybody was saying that Russian economy is going to collapse because of the sanctions. So that's the question, that's why it hasn't collapsed, and so why the sanctions haven't brought Russia to economic collapse. So, and we are actually discussing the outlook for 2025. Russian official numbers show even quite a substantial economic growth. Does it has to do something with the resources, the abundance of resources that Russia has? Does it has to do something with circumvention of the sanctions and shadow fleets and whatnot? Public investment and war, which, as according to some experts, constitutes close to 1/3 of the federal budget. Is it because of the friendly China? Is it because of militarization of society or the success of the central bank policies? Well, those are many issues that are on my list, which in this case I'm hoping that at least some of them are going to be addressed. If not answered, then at least addressed. I would like to invite the acting head of for the second time, acting head of the European Commission, Andris Kužnieks, to say a couple of opening words and maybe also from the Commission perspective, why didn't it collapse?
Many thanks, Carlis. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege for me to speak to you today. Well, I have unfortunate unique experience because I spent the whole year before the start of the war in Moscow. I was the EU diplomat working at the EU delegation. So I remember a few weeks after the start of the war, suddenly my Western credit card didn't work. So we faced with the challenge that we could not, first of all, take out money and we could not pay anymore. So our life for diplomats became more difficult. But of course, that is peanuts compared to what came afterwards. And I think we have gone through a long way. And Carlis, I think in our announcement for this panel, we write rather that the glass is half empty. But I would like to say that glass is rather half full, you know. So it's a matter on how you look at it. And maybe a few points from my side on sanctions and their impact on Russia's economy. Of course, I mean, I guess that's the matter for economists to study and analyze and give their assessment on how effective the sanctions have been, 17 rounds already, and what's the future, you know. But I think there are clear facts that speak for sanctions because, of course, nobody, and I guess many of you would agree with me that, of course, sanctions cannot stop the war, but of course they can make life more difficult for those who persuade the war. I think that's the objective of the sanctions. And that's also, I think, the impact of the sanctions on Russia because the data, economic data clearly say that the sanctions are working. For example, Russia is now selling its resources at discount. And in order to buy something, they are paying high premium. And there's a clear negative impact on the economy. And Russian economy, that's the assessment of the Commission, is that it's at its near full capacity of battling high inflation, which is currently above 10%. Okay, not that high, but still. And 25 estimate is 9.3%. And it's far exceeding its target of 4% set by Russians. imagine the interest rates, especially when we speak about Russian public, so it's 21%. We speak here about a few percent interest rates that are hurting us when the interest rates were high. So Russians are experiencing 21%. And of course they are spending their national wealth fund, which now, according to assessment, is 65% lower than it was before the war. So I think they have, spent their reserves quite greatly. Thanks to EU and G7 energy sanctions and the recent proposals, and we hope that these proposals will be adopted on REPowerEU policy, which is aimed at basically getting rid of Russian fossil fuels and energy resources. The Russian revenues have fallen from 100 billion euros in 2022 to 22 billion in 2024. So it's a drop of 80%, which also shows the impact of sanctions and joint work. If you look at the export restrictions towards Russian economy, then of course it has been cut off from dual-use goods. We understand that, of course, one or another way they are still trying to circumvent, and I think such countries like Latvia at the forefront of also customs controls is very, I think, essential and a very important player. And of course, compared to what was it before the war, Russia has lost 60% of the trading with the EU before the war. What is important for the Commission, and I'll be short, is that we continue pushing these sanctions. We also continue work on decreasing capabilities for third countries to circumvent the sanctions. There our public diplomacy, and diplomacy is very important. And in that way, we can achieve our objectives to make life for Russian economy difficult, for Putin to continue war difficult. With that, I stop here. Many thanks for Institute organizing this event, for you to participate and have a good discussion.
Thank you, Andris, so much. And if we are in a thank you section, then of course many thanks to the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation for supporting the Riga Dialogue for many years, to the European Commission representation, to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, to European Leadership Network for all the assistance that has been provided. We had one of the conclusions which I liked in the previous panels. Russia is not invincible, but it's inevitable. So Kai Olaf Lang, I would like you to what are you, by the way? Ah, here you are. Okay, next to the cameras. That's a sly move, so that I don't look into that. Kai Olaf Lang, the senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP. You have been a friend for the Latvian International Affairs and a frequent collaborator for decades. I'm not over-exaggerating when I'm saying decades, so please, the floor is yours, the panel is yours. Be so kind and try to provide us with some of the answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlis, for this opportunity and for the challenge to navigate us through such a multifaceted area. Thank you for the nice introduction. There are more and more events when I hear that I am a veteran of conferences, but this is not necessarily something which is bad, a non-militant veteran, of course. I will start, before going to our excellent panelists, with a quotation regarding our topic, and the quote comes from the Royal United Services Institute, a very renowned British think tank, and it was from the beginning of this year. Although Russia undoubtedly faces significant challenges, there is little suggest that these will result in any significant political consequences that might prompt the Kremlin to rein in its ambitions in Ukraine. That's a very sobering analysis, and I'm interested what our conclusion this evening will be. I would like to tackle basically, and Karlis sketched out the basic issues we are facing. I would like to tackle with our discussants basically three general issues. The first question would be, now, with 3 years of war, with sanctions in place, what is the general condition of the Russian economy, also of the Russian budget? Why has the economy been so resilient? What were the buffers or the mechanisms to absorb also the shocks or the challenges? Second, what problems does Russian economy face? Is it sanctions? Is it low oil prices or other effects? And it's a notion which is used very often. Is Russia's economy at the moment a wartime economy? There are some which contest that notion, that it's not yet so far advanced. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is on sanctions proper, economic sanctions of the West, of the European Union. How effective are they in economic terms? But also, how are sanctions perceived by Russian society? Is this a challenge for the leadership in Russia? And of course, finally, what are the prospects for the war, but also for a time when the shooting will have stopped? I stop talking here, and I would like to introduce you to our two panelists. We have Iain Begg, who is a professor at the European Institute of the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is an excellent, maybe the best expert on EU common market, EU finances, and I'm very grateful because I also have a sort of déformation professionnelle, because I look very often through EU glasses, to the glasses of European politics, to what is going on also in Eastern Europe. So Iain is an ideal part of our debate. And then we have Alexey Yusupov, who is the director of the Russia program of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, which is a co-organizer of this event. So we will start with a rather economic perspective coming from Iain. Please, Iain, the floor is yours.
Well, first, I'll attempt to say Labvaka. I know one or two of you might understand my pronunciation. The question of sanctions is a tricky one, because they have an enormously long history, and it's not a terribly distinguished history, if you think about it. Where have sanctions really been effective? They've been imposed on Iran for decades. The mullahs are still there. They maybe worked a bit in South Africa, but it took a very long time. So I thought a way to start would be first to just go through a typology of the sorts of sanctions that are being used. And I've made five main headings. The first is financial. Freeze the assets, we know about this. The Russian central bank's assets, the oligarchies' money, and as has already been mentioned by Andris, the fact that the payment systems were blocked. These are means of putting pressure through the financial system. Also, some of the yachts were captured of the oligarchy. There used to be a nice saying that the world is split into the have-nots and the have-yachts, except now the have-yachts have not yachts, if you're still following me. So there's something going on there. Second, quite clearly, curbing the exports of those countries which are subject to sanctions, which in this case is predominantly Russia, maybe a bit Belarus. And This matters because it's reinforced by having not just an attempted prohibition on the sales of those assets, but also trying to put an oil price cap. And here we get a paradox at the heart of it. The Russians are still exporting oil and gas to Europe. And it's only recently that the pipeline across Ukraine has been stopped. Isn't this bizarre? A sanction through which you connive to make it work. Third sort of thing, already been mentioned as well, is that sanctioning countries say you may not buy the following exports from us. And this is something that can be progressive in its impact. It takes a while to progress to make it really bite, because the spare parts are not there, the capacity to renew your air fleet, commercial airliners, these sorts of things are inhibited. Fourth, stopping individuals from moving. Now this really hurt the Russian oligarchy, because they are told you cannot come to certain countries, and that gets in the way. But the one that's neglected sometimes is allegedly what the White House is now considering, and that is secondary sanctions. Now, the significance of secondary sanctions is that the White House, if it ever gets around to saying it, could say to a country like India, if you continue to buy oil from Russia, we will block your exports from India to the United States. Now, the Americans have used this in successive iterations of using sanctions over the years, and it's been pretty powerful in its impact, because if you don't obey it, you lose the American market. Like the economic effects, second. I wonder why I mentioned this, but if you think about it, sanctions are quite like tariffs. And I don't know if anybody's got any ideas about where tariffs might arise in the world economy at present, because what they do is they create an incentive to diversify from the external economy to the domestic economy, or go to alternative suppliers which are going to be less efficient. And the theory of economic integration dating back to the 1950s said trade creation is good because you're going to a lower cost producer. Trade diversion is bad because you go to a higher cost producer, and there are inefficiencies for everybody. It affects both sides of the equation on sanctions. So but it does provide this impetus to the Russian economy, and I think that's what we're seeing. There is Russian production replacing international production. In addition, that has a further potential effect, which is to raise the potential tax base of the sanctioned economy, enabling them to finance more. But at the same time, they lose their opportunity to get new finance, to get new technologies and spare parts for the airplanes that I mentioned, etc. Now, very briefly on the Russian economy, because much of it's already been introduced, the huge dependence on primary industries, especially hydrocarbons. That is the Russian economy. The Russian economy really ought to be far, far richer if you think of some of the other hydrocarbon-based economies in the Gulf, those that do it very well. And that means they're vulnerable. If oil prices fall, as they have done, everything gets worse for Russia. And let me ask a rhetorical question to everybody in the room. Have you ever gone into a shop and bought something labeled Made in Russia? Why not? Because they don't produce anything except armaments and downstream products of the hydrocarbon industry. But the Russian economy is currently benefiting from what might loosely be called military Keynesianism. The economists among you will recognize that a Keynesian expansion is one where the public sector spends money to boost the economy. It makes sense in certain contexts. It's military. I know you mentioned that the sovereign debt fund is being depleted, but their national debt is low. Certainly the national debt of the Russians would make most European finance ministers salivate if they could have something as low as Russian debt. But there are huge costs involved. I found one statistic that they're spending $22 million a day on persuading new recruits into the military. Now that's a huge amount of money which accumulates. And it means as well that if all this money is going to the military, it is not going to social projects. It's not going to the crumbling infrastructure, the other sorts of things that citizens might want. So that's where the pressure point comes. You mentioned the high interest rates, yes. 21%, but that's prohibitive. It really deters investment, but there's a tension there for the central bank. Do you hit it and risk the wrath of Putin in the way that Jay Powell in the US is upsetting Donald Trump. What's happening is that Russia clearly has been able to initiate a pivot towards Asia. Asian markets, India, China, they are the alternative to Western Europe. But that's not quick or easy, because you can't build a pipeline from Siberia to China in 10 minutes. Maybe in a couple of years, but it takes a long time. So there are multiple reasons for the economy to be slowing, and that is the bottom line. So I'll conclude by posing a rhetorical question. Do sanctions work? Or maybe a sub-question, could they work? Well, the first observation is there are so many loopholes, and if you look across the international community, it's not universally supported. Much of so-called South, global South, doesn't support it. The shadow fleet has been very effective, and it's at least the new target of the 17th package of EU sanctions, 17, the war that's lasted 4 years, less than 4 years. That's an awful lot of packages of sanctions, and still, even within the EU, you get certain countries, one quite close to here, which is rather reticent about sanctions. There's hesitation about expropriating the financial assets, because there are many who say, you've taken all this money from the Russians, frozen it, why don't we use it to spend on Ukraine? Well, if you get into a game of expropriating financial assets, it may work in the short term in relation to Ukraine, but what signal does it send to the rest of the world? So I think there is a doubt in Europe about how forceful to be on this. You can use maybe the return on the assets as is currently happening. However, the US has the capability to change the game. If it were to impose secondary sanctions and enforce them, that would change the game. So 2 verdicts. The first, do sanctions work? No, they do not. At best, are very slow acting. But the second verdict is, and here I have to bring the gestures out, it's a drip, drip, drip process. And at some point, that drip, drip, drip is going to reach a tipping point where all of a sudden the Russians really feel it. Thank you.
Thank you, yeah. Thank you very much, Iain. And you implicated, I think, there is an implicit question to this kind of do sanctions work issue. What is the objective of sanctions? I think we should bear it in mind to bring a country to stop certain way of, to change the behavior of a country, at least in the long run. What are the objectives of the sanctions? I mean, in general, we know it not to bring Russia to their knees, but just to bring them to halt their aggressive military campaign.
I think my answer in one word would be termites. You're trying to undermine the foundations of the Russian ability to wage war.
I think there is also a sort of domestic dimension of sanctions, because sanctions also go along with costs for those who impose them. And you need the acceptance and the support of societies, of businesses. So I think for the political leadership, it's always important to clearly communicate what the objective is, because sometimes there are misunderstandings. Last question to you at that point, what would you propose to make, and you sketched out these categories of sanctions, what would you say are ways to make them more efficient?
Well, I think the secondary sanctions are the route that's going to make the big difference now, because the primary sanctions just on Russia are clearly not working sufficiently effectively. If those countries which are breaking the sanctions, whether voluntarily or because they don't politically support them, are then told you are going to be hit by this if you continue, that would clearly stop them.
Very clear assessment, even though in the current US administration, there are obviously some thoughts to do just the opposite, to even, if there is a scenario of normalization with Russia, to lift some of the sanctions. But Well, we'll see.
But one thing is certain about this current American administration, which is they are uncertain.
Right. Consensus. Now, Alexey, it is very important for us to learn more about what the perception of the sanction has been so far in the Russian society, in different parts of the country, in different parts of the society. For example, also beyond the big agglomerations and the huge cities. Whom did sanctions hit, and who is bothered by it? And has it any sort of created any sort of a problem for the government? In economic terms, you might argue that he had said they work like tariffs in a way, so they have produced inflation to some extent. So inflation is an aspect, but sometimes inflation is even convenient for governments if it's not kind of too strong. So what are the implications for society?
Right, thank you so much. You've cannibalized some of my points in your intervention before, so let me do a step back and actually come back to this question, how do you measure if they work or not, without defining first what they're supposed to achieve? And I would offer you a definition which I think makes sense to go into domestic politics of avoidance of sanctions and dealing with sanctions. I mean, sanctions are a way for a third party to intervene into domestic cost-benefit analysis. I mean, the Russian strategy is, as any strategy, trying to achieve some aims with the means they have. And so either we want them to change the aims, or we want to make their means much more costly, much more risky, much more bloody, much more destabilizing, and so on. So all of the sanctions can be measured against that backdrop. Because if you say the aim is change of behavior, that's a very high aim, you know. So, I mean, I think Rhodesia might be the only case where there was some behavioral change of international sanctions. So before we look at how the Russian government and the system deal with sanctions, you need to see what's actually the strategy. So what is the Russian economy trying to achieve in terms of aims? And I would propose 4, and they're conflicting, as always. So you do have this, the primary aim to sustain and also to extend the war effort. You have the aim of preventing, and that includes it, preventing overstretch by the war. You have the aim of macroeconomic stability, and that one is important because you're managing your juggling balls, and the other ball you need to take care of is preventing domestic conflicts, and it's distributional conflicts and elite conflicts at the same time. And the economy needs to do it because Putinist Russia is a very capitalist society. It's a distorted form of state-led capitalism, but it's capitalistic, and I will come to it in a second. The next ball they're juggling is actually prevent the erosion of legitimacy of Putin's Russia, which was built on the idea that this is the most prosperous Russia which has ever existed, and this is objectively the case. I mean, he's never readdressed his own promise to overtake Portugal in terms of GDP per capita, which he issued himself during his first presidency, but people still remember, and the civilian bloc of his government knows that until the large war, there was a development promise to the statehood, saying, look, there is a certain way into the future which includes decarbonization, because everyone knows that there's going to be an era on the horizon where even China and India might not be in need of Russian carbon. So you had some kind of an idea, and this was part of the German-Russian relationship. You need to modernize. There might be some compatibilities in terms of what industry fits what. This strategy has gone away, by the way. So there is no promise, and military Keynesianism is not an answer, and everyone knows it because it will have an end. In this thesis of an eternal war as an economic model is absolutely nonsensical. So this is that aim. And the last aim, I would say, is actually, well, the macroeconomic stability by itself. It's so funny. Elvira Nabiulina, who you probably all know as Russia watchers, the central banker who was lauded after 2014 by her European colleagues for being the best European central banker for avoiding the sanctions imposed by the colleagues who awarded her the award. So what I think was underestimated is that sanctions are instances for political learning, and Russia has learned a lot from 2014. Firstly, it has learned to prepare itself. So the low debt that you refer to didn't come just appear. The reserves were built upon, and also they looked into capital control instruments and how to prepare for a second hit of sanctions. And I mean, we all remember, as President Biden has claimed, that SWIFT is the nuclear option. Does anybody remember SWIFT? Was it the nuclear option? I think it was a sincere miscalculation on the Western side. And I think this has to do with political arrogance, not understanding that sanctions in a highly globalized world do not work as they were supposed to work in a world where there is a big sanctioning entity and a small entity receiving sanctions. And so this is just not the world we're into. And so now I'm coming back to my major point, saying this war effort is sustained not just by the macroeconomic stability in the stats, but by the high effort that Kremlin produces and does day to day to maintain economic normalcy, however absurd this might seem, for the absolute majority of its population. The absolute majority of its population is shielded from the shocks which the juggling of those aims and balls produces. And this includes, first, transfers, obviously, high spending on social programs, and also it's not just recruitment. I mean, look in the latest budget they published. The military budget is going to go down, actually, in a position to many of the media observers see. The social budget goes up, housing budget goes up, because they need to accommodate needs and expectations of many people, both coming back from the front, but also their families, that the subjective feeling of life still improving, as if there are still in Putin's Russia of 2008 or 2014 or 2022, that it still continues. And this is not doable infinitively, but they're doing it at the moment. And the second thing is actually circumventing sanctions on goods, parallel imports. And I think just the notion, as you mentioned, I think it's 50% of world GDP which participates in sanctions. That leaves the second 50% of world GDP at least not participating, which equals to avoiding it, to helping to avoid it. By the instruments Russia has actually tested during COVID. So reconfiguration of trade routes, if Hong Kong is closed down and there are no problems in other ports, how do you do it? How do you create entities in the Arab Emirates and Turkey and so on and so forth. So they have learned a lot, and I think this is why the perception of sanctions, coming to a question, Kai Olaf, I don't want to escape it, but the perception of sanction is the Europeans have miscalculated the distribution of costs. Because what you allude to, it's not just the commonality of sanctions, so many parties should participate for them to work. It's also the distribution of costs, and the costs are distributed between Russia, third parties, and let's say the EU. And the popular narrative is they shot themselves in their own leg. And it is misleading to say that there are no costs. The costs are deferred. They will be there, and they're starting to appear. This is the first quarter, I think, where I can see not just slowing down, but even recessionary signals from all sectors except from military industry. But it is still, it's a Bremsspur, so that will take some time until this is relevant, and there are still reserves. And so the narrative is there, and the government can continue to maintain all of these four aims at the same time, giving them just much more time than Ukraine has. And the sanctions seem for the population as something that the West does because, and funnily enough, I will close here, I agree, there is a different political function to sanctions. It's better than to do nothing. Very often sanctions on the list of options for policymakers are the one they can go for because all others do not fit into their domestic risk-benefit calculations. So this is why you see the latest 17th package of sanctions. In many points, it's catching up with the American package. So it's, you do that because you can do that, and the other options are more costly. And to close, I would put it in a controversial way. Neither for Russia nor for the EU, this war and the sanctions are considered to be existential. The EU doesn't fight this as an existential crisis, and Russia doesn't avert it as an existential crisis. And this is why those realities are so muddy.
Thank you very much for that again, sobering view. Could you just say, in 3 words, something on the effects for so-called oligarchs and other kind of factions of elites?
Well, I think there was one, again, false assumption that we can create rifts and splits in different elite circles. This has not materialized. I mean, we can count on one hand people who have actively decided to actually jump ship. But interestingly enough, the maintenance of sanctions now allows the Russian government to do 2 things. First, now they start to prohibit parallel imports. So because some of the domestic economic elites and oligarchs say, okay, so we've driven out the competition. We hope Trump will never lift sanctions because now we've invested actually in producing stuff where made in Russia is printed on, and it's textile and it's agriculture and stuff like that. It's industrial upgrading by seizing the chance, and they actually want it to continue. So for many business elites, actually the continuation of this weird situation is now interesting. And secondly, I would say what we very rarely talk about, there is a huge, on the backflip, and this is the dark side of this war situation. Just as we speak, there is the biggest historic redistribution of private wealth which is happening in Russia illegally and violently. And it's happening very silently because officially Putin says, I've ended it. So I've ended the 90s when there was the primary capital accumulation, you know, and all of that wild capitalism, and now it's all orderly and legal, but that's not the case. If you look on the regional level, especially in southern regions like Krasnodar, or if you look at what's going on actually in the occupied and annexed territories, it's a huge process of well, illegal reallocation, just stealing and bribing and giving further properties of industrial size, which happens at the moment. And this is something where I wouldn't call them all oligarchs, because the business elites are much wider than that, and all of them are dissociated from power. I would say an oligarch should have, like Yeltsin had oligarchs. Putin doesn't really have oligarchs, to be honest. But for them, it's a mixed bag. And I think because it's a mixed bag, you will not see any rifts in any future, close future.
Could I throw in one small addition to that, which is the heavy payments going to the soldiers fighting the war, and even those who are killed or wounded, are predominantly going to poorer areas of Russia. Is that correct?
It's interesting. People are mostly recruited from poorer areas, but since it's a voluntary recruitment in terms of how the society perceives it, because the deal is, like for a rifleman, it's around 2,100 euros per month at the moment. Per platoon leader is 2,500 euros. Per 1 kilometer they advance, it's 500 euros additionally. Per 1 day they participate in the war, it's 50 euros additionally. Per, I think, light wound, it's up to 15,000 euro. And when a person dies, his family, if there is any, becomes up to 100,000 euros. So they have the cash. And we can look at it and see first, this guarantees high rates of voluntary subscription in terms of the social contract, because even if your neighbor gets their relatives in body bags, you do not consider this to be forced mobilization. In our conference, some of the experts have mentioned that Russia has sustained immense damage, but they can bear it. No, that's not the trick. The trick is that it's built upon a premise of individual decision. This is a very capitalistic move, saying, look, this is the money you can earn, which is not comparable to any other career options which are there. Well, from the left side, we're a left-leaning political foundation, we say, but the lack of opportunities makes it involuntarily. But that's not how it's perceived on a day-to-day basis in this society, which is very neoliberal in many respects. So, and you can track the money, actually. And the money, by a very high rate, stays at the front. Because it's a very specific demographic who go there. I mean, many of them do not have families. Many of them spend it there to bribe their commanders to take leave, for prostitution, for acquiring of properties on the annexed territory. So you have a huge war economy, and this is the only case where I would use war economy as a legitimate term. It's at the front. So this is also why, I guess, inflationary pressure is not that felt back at home.
One question to Iain. You used this notion of not war economy, but military Keynesianism. Now, we had periods in history when the Soviet Union and the West had relatively high shares of expenditures for defense and security. And in this race, the Soviet Union lost. Now, we have a kind of different economic model in Russia, call it as you like, state capitalism or distorted state capitalism, whatever. How long is this sustainable? And if the West goes up with military expenditures, what we are witnessing at the moment, what does this mean for the Russian economy and its resilience?
It's obviously going to depend how long the war lasts, but the fiscal arithmetic is still reasonably favorable for the Russian economy because its debt to GDP ratio is in the teens. In France, it's 120. So there's your answer. And
Russian soldiers are paid in rubles, and not everything, but also kind of military hardware production in the military-industrial complex is paid in finance by rubles.
And I also think agriculture, so military production, agriculture, and some specific groups of, light industrial produce, but also some of that can stay localized, and will never be adequate to the levels Russia had before, but that's enough for specific groups to feel a sectoral improvement, saying now, and this is comparable to 2014 and the sanctions after which the Russian agriculture actually took off, because without the protectionism which we imposed on them, they were not able to compete. Now they are. And at the moment it's interesting because those protectionist measures which are there, for example, there is a huge tractor fabric in St. Petersburg and Leningrad, formerly very known. It's protected even against Belarusian competitors. And by that they can produce. So this is what I mentioned at the beginning, but there is no theory after that because they will never be able to, compete up to a certain level, then open up. They cannot repeat the South Korean, the Vietnamese, the whatever other developmental path. They cannot do it. And their domestic market is just minuscule for that. But for this moment of time, it seems like things are okay. And things are okay is what Putin needs. He doesn't need more.
I think that's the moment where I would like to open up our debate here on the panel for questions and comments from the audience, and I already see a couple of hands. Please tell us who you are and be brief in your comment or question. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Much appreciated. To your knowledge, has there been any kind of balance sheet report on the cost and benefits of Putin's war in Ukraine? For example, Russia has gained territory, population, resources, but it has also lost many things. Not to get into detail, you guys know it better than I do, probably. Of course, when you talk about sanctions, and I'd like you to address this point, it seems to me that beyond all the things that you discuss, enforcement is a real issue too. Based on the information that I have, the sanctions were not enforced properly, certainly in Europe. Lots of different industrial CEOs have told me that they're pretending it, but it's not real. So the enforcement issue is a serious issue. I would appreciate your response. If there is such a study, please let me know. If there isn't, why hasn't there been one? Thank you.
Could you tell us who you are or whom do you...
I'm sorry, Hamid Lajvardi, American Baltic Investments.
You asked to my knowledge, and to my knowledge, no. I don't think there is such a study. I very much doubt that the Russian Ministry of Finance follows the edicts of the European Commission, which insists that impact assessment should be done on major investment projects. Now, as to enforcement of sanctions, well, I mentioned a few of them in my introductory remarks. The fact that gas was still flowing across Ukraine until last year tells you that it was only a partial enforcement. But the Russians have also been very effective in finding the parallel ways of getting products in from neighboring, more friendly countries. And until recently, the shadow fleet was very successful in exporting oil to elsewhere. Whether the new sanctions from the European Commission are going to inhibit that remains to be seen, but I would be, shall we say, somewhat dubious.
I can really add to that. So I also don't think there is I also don't think the Russians know. I think the question is not posed in that way. What have we lost and what have we won? Because it's again deferred over time, and it's a struggle for concepts like technological sovereignty and things which are so hard to calculate. I don't think we need to assume because of this that there is no rationality behind it. I think we can very clearly see that Putin and his close confidants very well know what they don't know, so they don't know how to run the economy. I mean, even Turkey has politically intervened in its central bank day-to-day business by now. Russia hasn't. The 21% key rate sparks fierce opposition among loyal business people saying, how am I supposed to recredit myself, even from the military-industrial sector? Look at Chemezov and Rostech, which is instrumental for many lines of production. They pay every single day. They pay politicians and pundits in Russian newspapers who attack the central bank director personally, saying she is the reason why our pensioners will die without money and in hunger. She needs to curb down the interest rate, but she doesn't, and Putin doesn't intervene. So I would say, you know, there is a lot of understanding that, you know, the calculation needs to be done, but I'm not sure someone has actually done it.
Why hasn't the US or Europe done that?
I think they've had more immediate priorities, but I don't know.
Enforcement?
Do you have a follow-up or? Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, hello. My name is Uwe Optenhögel. I'm from a think tank in Brussels. The point we are getting at now tells me that it's a gamble. I mean, it's a gamble from Putin and his surrounding, and it's a high gamble. Because if they don't know how to run the economy, they become more dependent on China every day. Yeah, it's a bet on time. And what happens if it doesn't work?
I think it's a good way to put it. It's a gamble. I also think that in our debate, be it for the European or the Russian decision-making, and as we revise it, we very rarely speak about bad decision-making. A lot of bad decisions have been made, starting with the invasion by itself, and now the Russian government tries to deal with the effects as well. And this is why it's a gamble in some respect, and then the others, the Kremlin is set to specific aims and is not going to, you know, deviate from that. So, but bad decision making, it's actually well researched that, you know, we never use this. We always think there is a strategy which is coherent and, you know, infallible. Yes, it's not. I think one of the things that we need to consider is actually that this part of dealing with costs and how they're distributed over the society and over the elites is equally important to the Kremlin as military progress. So I'd actually claim that we can see quite a limited military success. I'm not a military expert, there are a lot of you here in the room, but if you look at the square kilometers they've took last year and the aims they themselves proclaimed, and again, the attrition rate and so on, it's not like it's a self-running scheme. And again, they're actually looking at the economy, their bottleneck is not cash, and it's not revenue, and it's resilience to sanctions, it's the demography. It looks better than in Ukraine, but it's also very, very bad. So if you add the people who were mobilized, the people who have died already, the people who changed civilian jobs to military jobs because they're paying better, much better, this is part of the inflation the central bank tries to curb. If you look at the hundred thousands of people who have left for political reasons, and if you look at the labor migrants from Central Asia who used to fill the gaps, but after the big terror attack on the Crocus City Hall in Moscow, beginning of last year, the immigration policy of Russia have started to shift towards very xenophobic tone. I mean, they've had it before, but now it's even more. It adds up to 7% of the active labor force. It's immense. So we don't know when, but they will run into troubles. Maybe in 2 years, maybe in 3 years, no one can tell. This is why it's a gamble. I agree with you, Uwe.
The only thing to add is that we sometimes neglect the labor market as a source of pressure.
Yeah, good point.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Sparane. I am a member of youth NGOs Jeff Latvia and Club the House, Youth for United Europe. And I have heard a theory that EU should be as aggressive with sanctions as the United States with their tariff plan. Do you believe this theory or not? Thank you.
I missed the bit where you said that as the Americans are with
tariffs.
Terrorists.
Yeah, no, tariffs.
Oh, tariffs.
Yes.
Right.
Learning from Trump. Or
Yes, exactly.
we don't know if Trump is
Well, you
successful
see,
with it.
This comes back to the question of the ability to enforce. Because if you said to all European countries and tried to dictate it from Brussels, saying you may no longer buy any Russian gas, no Russian oil, no Russian grain, and you then said to Orban in Hungary or Pedro Sanchez in Madrid, this is the new reality, I don't think you get many takers. And it's important to recognize that decision-making in the EU is highly influenced by individual member states, so that the idea that there is a capacity to decide and enforce at the level of Brussels is misplaced. And this means that you don't have the coherence that enables you to do the war on sanctions in the same way as you do a war on terror, where there is that coherence in Washington.
In some cases, you are going to have coalitions of sanctions willing. Yeah, but it's not possible everywhere, of course.
As far as I understood, I mean, you probably know it better, Kai Olaf, but tariffs are interesting to some European policymakers because you can decide them on a sub-political level, so the Commission can actually introduce them. And if you look at the Russian fertilizers, I think this is an avenue, although again, I'm not a subject matter expert on that, I don't know how much it will harm them and the Europeans. So, and if it harms the Europeans more than the Russians, there are good arguments and should be done because it would decrease their capacity in a lower level than it would erode support for Ukraine in Europe. And we probably need support for Ukraine in Europe for decades to come. This is an important resource. And it's very often forgotten that the decisiveness or aggressiveness of sanctions, I mean, in Germany, we just escaped the situation barely by 0.02% of popular vote that the very pro-Putinist party would have entered the Bundestag, just like that, after being created a couple of months ago. And so it's a consideration policymakers also have, and if, you know, putting 100% of tariffs on fertilizers will not slow down the military machine on the other side, and I guess it wouldn't, then probably it's not a good idea to do it.
But that's also an example that you have to look at the whole story in a holistic way. Actually, one of the few remaining fertilizer producers in Germany, SKW Piesteritz in Wittenberg, they are arguing for sanctioning Belarusian and Russian producers because they say the gas prices for us are so high that we are not competitive. so paradoxically, they're in favor of a tough line.
I think an economist like me would say this is mixed incentives.
Also, Karlis at the beginning, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Iain and Alexey, for a wonderful discussion. Sorry, it's just weird to be asking questions at our own events. There's this, I just really want to ask. Senator Lindsey Graham is promising, I quote, bone-crushing sanctions against Russia. What would it entail? What would be actually sanctions against Russia which would hurt it so much? Maybe not, Russia is not going to change its course, but it's going to feel its effects very visibly.
I think, again, the secondary sanctions on countries which continue to deal with Russia is where the bones get crushed.
Yeah, probably that. But absurdly enough, and it's important to understand, you can only sanction effectively if you're close to someone. If you're distant and disentangled and there are no interconnections, then your bone-crushing sanctions are very hard to come by, and you have to hurt third countries. I mean, let's also be honest about that. I'm not in his constituency, he's not my representative, but if a European policymaker would say, let's introduce bone-crushing sanctions, which would hit in Kazakhstan, in Armenia, in Turkey, and somewhere else.
In Tennessee.
My question would be, did we think about what this will do with our standing towards those economies, countries, and governments? Because we speak all the time about building coalitions, and we failed at isolating Russia. And then we act as if we can actually repeat, repeat what has been done in the Cold War and build a wall around, our adversary. And the question is, it means then wherever you contain through a certain market, it forces this market and this society to pick sides. And I wouldn't be as sure that if we as Europeans would put them on the line, be it Armenia or Turkey, whoever, they would say, all right, now you are talking, and now we're going to implement your bone-crushing sanctions. I'm afraid we would fail, and I would afraid that we would be weaker after the attempt than before. So, I don't know.
Gentleman in the second row there.
Yes, my name is Andris. I'm Director of Planning Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Latvia, and thank you for excellent presentations. My question is, what could be Putin's exit strategy? I mean, well, we now understand there's economy more or less what's happening. Let's assume that war stops. I mean, for whatever reason, what happens or what could happen. and what incentives Putin has to stop war, or what incentives he has not to stop war, as you already started to say in some part. Thank you.
Well, I think there are ample advantages available to the Russian economy from stopping the war. Opening up of markets that have been, at least to some degree, frozen, the capacity to bring in technology, which has been inhibited, the willingness, apparently, of the current US administration to re-engage Russia in the global economy. All these are the sorts of incentives that could mark a change if the war is ended. But the difficulty here is that Russia is sort of boxed in to the way the economy has evolved. It may not be an entirely military economy, but it's a significantly militarized economy, which, if you start to undo it, is going to hit people who are dependent on that military economy. So it will be a new transition, as happened under Yeltsin, maybe not with the same approach to oligarchs, but it's certainly going to be a new transition, and transitions are never painless.
Smart demilitarization of the economy.
Oh, it's a big issue. So, I mean, you can see and you can actually read how local governance officials and business leaders are very puzzled by the exit. They also don't know how it will end. But, I mean, Vladimir Putin has surprised not just Ukraine and us, but also his own apparatus and his own country in 2022. And so now everyone prepares for everything because they also don't know. They know even less than us. That means that we can see what kind of questions and problems they themselves, as being responsible, let's say, for local administration in Russia, pose. And for example, it's the question of demobilization. So if he and Trump signs a deal and then 100,000 of fighters come back, where are the resources to not just house them, but also there is no increase in local policing, and a lot of people are concerned about violence they will bring back and crime and so on. There is no resources for psychosocial reintegration. There is no resources on the labor market. I mean, in the 90s, they all went to the violence economy, you know, security services and racketing, but also private military companies, and this is all became, at some point, what we all know Wagner has done out of it. So this we can see, so people are puzzled. We also can see, Uwe, coming back to your point, that business leaders are very concerned about what's actually the red line with China, because it started to happen so quickly, the exit of the Western business partners and the entrance of China, that there hadn't been an industry-wide discussion on what is the Russian national interest vis-a-vis China. The Russian... No, of course it's not. I mean, yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, your colleague Janis Kluge, Kai Olaf, he's calculated. I mean, it's like Russia takes everything which China has to offer, but China gives very little. So if you look over 2 decades, the share of Russian trade in the Chinese stats has not actually increased, whereas in the Russian stats, the share of China trade in import and export has, exploded. So these questions obviously are there, and so everyone wants to know if there is a strategy. And the longer it takes, the more they will accumulate. Again, it's an autocracy, so it's not pressure in the democratic sense, but it's a factor. And I think how the war continues, it has an inherent conflict of aims. You could take more militarily, but the more you take, the higher will be the cost and the problems of legitimizing it and ending it. You can end it now fairly easily if you ask Donald Trump, but then it's not enough for your security concerns. And so that's their own internal conflict of aims. So, and I guess this is one of the factors which will play into the question when and how Russia, if they will start exiting this.
Yeah, thank you. Jan Skarknic, I'm also from the foreign ministry. I think that Russians are failing in achieving the initially announced aims of the war, the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. I think now it is more about territories and resources of the territories they have acquired and then want to acquire more. But in your answer, I think that there is a bit of a contradiction because what happened with the sanctions, Russians said that they would develop national economy and they would develop national industry and production made in Russia. Now, stopping the war from their perspective allowing again foreign competition coming in, basically they would destroy what they started to build. And I think that there is this contradiction. They probably are not interested in ending the war also from their domestic industrial perspective, because they would bring competition and they would ground their industry.
I think the solution to that would be to take some lessons from Trump. Ask everybody else to open up to them, but impose tariffs at home so that exactly the problem you mentioned doesn't arise.
Also, the share of those businesses who are clear beneficiaries of the war and who have expanded into the loops and gaps left by Western competition is very low. And it's not state-led business, it's very often private business. And if we know one thing from how the Kremlin deals with the macroeconomic policy, they wouldn't care. And so they actually cry for more protectionism. But it's not the share which is decisive, I would claim.
But anyway, the government will have enough instruments to kind of play on this.
Sure, at the moment they've introduced this bill that all share driving services, all taxes, all of that all of them are mandatory to buy Russian-produced cars. Sounds good, but if you look actually at the car sector after the Western companies have left and the Chinese have entered, the level of local production in terms of how much percentage of Russian-produced screws and parts and so on is in a Chinese-produced vehicle under Russian brand has lowered. So especially if you are a proponent of technological sovereignty, how they call it, and building up Russian industries, you can see that that doesn't work on the scale of car economy, at least car sector, at least.
Mark 2.
Just another brief intervention. I mean, if ending the war would liberate the economy, which it certainly could, and your problem, the one you mentioned, could be dealt with tariffs over time. There are instruments. The problem is that it would end Putin's system. Because if you liberate the economy and you let it really go according to capitalist criteria, he cannot control any longer what he's controlling now. So it's not in the interest of Putin and his clique to liberate the economy, would be my thesis. If at all, they can only do it in a very dosed way, under control. But this is difficult, because they missed the point in the 90s to go the Chinese option. The Chinese option was turn capitalist, but under control of the party. And we all see where they got with this, extremely effective, and they got extremely far. But the Russians messed it completely up. They are still a rent economy based on their raw materials, and they are not competitive with maybe the exception of some military technologies, which I wouldn't underestimate, because these are double-use technologies. But apart from that, poor economic performance.
I think this is, in some respects, it's the curse of resource-rich economies. Look at Argentina, which 150 years ago was one of the richest countries in the world, and they've screwed it up. The elevation from primary production to secondary and tertiary production is the way that a country like China has got rich. China's maybe even moving beyond the manufacturing era into one where services will become a bigger component of their prosperity. I think the challenge to any Russian leader, whether it's Putin or a completely new generation, is going to be, do you want to try to follow that model? And my sense is that the pressures inside Russia will inhibit it quite badly.
Yeah, hello, my name is Emil Zrekis. I'm a student from Riga Dialogue University, and I have a question about if Russia is in a really true state of a war economy, and if it want to, could it easily reverse it?
Easily, no.
I think it's worthwhile to say why this term is not helpful, because it sounds, at least in the German debate, that you think of the Second World War and so on. So the Russian economy definitely is put in service of achieving political aims, all which partly are military, and it is the war. But there are markets. This wasn't the case in the Soviet Union. There are price signals which are working. This wasn't the case in the Soviet Union. There is a whole generation of smart business leaders who profit from their businesses. This wasn't the case in the Soviet Union. And you have this technocrat group of people, be it Mishustin, be it Silanov, be it Nabiullina, who, again, by their own European colleagues have been described as the best of the best worldwide. So these are the differences. I would say when these things start to disappear, then we're moving towards war economy, whatever that means exactly. And then, not being an economist, I have to concede, probably it's going to be a very narrow path to one direction. And the way back would be extremely costly and would... I mean, you see, Putin avoids with all costs to actually shaken up the Russian society. And the economic situation is part of that. So again, the mobilization is mostly monetary, and people accept the death toll because they think that this is a fair deal and it's some kind of a casino. Second of all, it's consumerist. As long as everything you want to buy, you can buy in Russia. And this is the case because of the parallel imports, but also because of, to be honest, like our corporate policies and, you know, how Apple does business and how BMW does business and so on. The Russians don't see any difference. So that's that. And the third one, I think like the state philosophers, if they have any of Russia, have actually read up on the latest part of the debate in the Western political sciences, saying it's always the question. So your proclivity to be a democrat or an autocrat in a generation is not necessarily connected to institutions and values and whatever. It's connected to the question whether you've spent the formative years of your life with rising life standards under a specific system. So the Germans after the Second World War have risen to new prosperity. I mean, UK has still had food stamps, and in Germany they already were bathing in food. And so this is what formed the generation of leaders which are only now exiting the scene and also in the society. And in Russia, it's Putinism. So people associate Putinism with rising quality of life. And now Russia burns a lot of fuel to stay in this place. It doesn't develop immensely. But at some point, the fuel will end, or they will need to answer the questions, what's next? And there is no answer.
Well, there is one which is sometimes neglected, and that is whether the opening up to international markets would include foreign capital. Now, for foreign capital to go back into Russia, bearing in mind how many companies had their fingers burned by the way they were expropriated and so on, would be a major challenge. But that's to some extent what Trump is dangling before Putin. He's saying, we reconnect you with the global economy. We have all these entrepreneurs who want to exploit the opportunities in Russia. Now that is win-win potentially, but it would require a severe transformation of Russia's approach to the rule of law and intellectual property rights, general property rights of companies and so on. So it's a major challenge.
We're running out of time. I would two final questions maybe.
Thank you for these excellent presentations. Gad Seglitz, I'm from the Stockholm School of Economics, alumni, also ex-minister. What has to happen for there to be hyperinflation in Russia, and how likely do you think it ever happening, like in the next 2 years or so? Because to me it seems like the threshold for Russian society economically is, I don't know where it is. Nobody knows probably. It's very, very, very. It's bottomless basically. So I think the only really pressure point that there could be is if there's like 1,000% hyperinflation. So thank you.
If the growth is going down, and it might go down, this is a driver for less inflation.
Well, yes.
Also, you have the exchange rate, which we have not talked about yet.
Right, but I think hyperinflation today, I would say, is unlikely because there is still the relative independence of the central bank, and that independence of the central bank is a protection against hyperinflation. If that were to be taken away, state control of the central bank, then you might have a greater risk of it. But the Russians have lived through this recently, so I think there is unlikely to be that willingness even to countenance the processes that would lead to hyperinflation. Maybe I'm being too, I won't say optimistic, but too sanguine about this.
Yeah, I can't. Yes, so I would just say that it's important for me, that you hear my message, it's not the bottomless ability to sustain pain. The pain is individualized and privatized, and the rest doesn't feel it. That's the secret formula. And so this is why sanctions are important, because they make life more complicated for their policymakers, even if it's bit by bit and if it's drip by drip, to sustain normalcy of the majority of the population who just have to accept the war. They don't need to support it, they need to accept it. The support comes from a fraction of the society. Opposition also comes from a fraction of the society. The majority, they are depoliticized and they don't want to do it. And so the economic pressure point is do more of that, do longer, and again, see the time horizon. The time horizon is a couple of years. So I guess in a couple of years, the pain will start to be distributed on the society, and then we'll see.
Yeah. And there is still the fact that although growth is slowing, it's still positive. Yeah. And that matters.
Well, good day and thank you everyone. My question will be about how you look the Africa territory in about Russia. What the Russia planning in the long term in this area that can be perhaps with economically, perhaps and politically, and if gonna be some consensus about maybe if you're gonna say this war, but I have many friends and many different people in Russia, they talk about where is the war. So if the bullet didn't come here from your window, you didn't saw any war or any of those kind of conflict. So ultimately I can say that also the last question, how you read the territory about North Korea, which is a lot of soldier import-export happening in these days, how it will be if gonna be they're gonna meet in the middle of nowhere, how it will be the situation, these one Africa continental and North Korea. Also, I am Efe, young journalist for European Commission. Thank you.
Try to, so I'll pick two things. I think that's exactly the point. There is no war for the majority. I mean, the war is obviously there, but the ability to disregard it is a product of a combination of a specific depoliticized political culture, and the Kremlin nourishes it very dearly. Consumerist society, and the fact that, you know, in your day-by-day life, your life is going on, and for many people it's actually improving in your subjective reading of the situation. So as long as that's the case, they can do it. That's again, that's a secret formula. Maybe just a short note on North Korea. I mean, you asked about that. Again, I can give you the Russian perspective because we monitor and track that a little bit more systematically. And I don't think it was such a big issue for them as it was for us, even until recently. And my understanding is even that it was the North Korean side who not just offered, but insisted on sending the detachment so that they can both be featured there, break the isolation, maybe collect some experience. And so, you know, 10,000 people, if we talk about demography, the Kremlin recruits per month around 30 to 45,000 people. 10,000 soldiers one time does not make it. It's not a game changer.
Maybe one last comment, which is that on the assumption that someday soon, you can define soon, the war ends, there is going to be a massive reconstruction effort in Ukraine, and to a lesser extent in bits of Russia that have been hit. The last estimate I saw was that the reconstruction of Ukraine is going to be of the order of $550 billion US dollars. 30% of, more than 30% now of Ukrainian territory is mined. Now these are massive expenses to deal with this, and that's going to be a bonanza for some companies, some of which could even be Russian.
Very final question from the American Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I didn't notice any discussion about the cultural and historical fission between Russia and China. If you go back a few centuries, you know how actually there's a strong discord, and I would even say hatred, based on several professors from the EU and even Moscow who've pointed that out. And the fact that Russia is the junior partner is really painful. There are lots of fissures, especially in eastern part of Russia, where the Chinese are slowly, taking over the economy. Is that something that should be considered as part of the strategic plan?
I've already stretched my competence. I do not think I'm able to comment on Russia-China cultural relations.
I can only say that you don't need to go centuries back. They've had a war against each other last century in the 60s. So yeah, it's not as all peachy as it seems.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, I will not do a summary of our debate, but I have a couple of takeaways, certainly. One takeaway is, I think we learned today that the Russian economy is not in a period of imminent modernization. It's rather a sort of longer period of adaptation, of asymmetric transformation and new dependencies, which are already emerging. Then I think we also saw that the Russian economy, and that was our assumption also in the description of this debate, that Russian economy is resilient. There has not been a collapse nor a crisis, nor an economic crisis. And that means that there are still relevant buffers, compensatory mechanisms, which enable Russia to continue with the campaign in Ukraine. And finally, on sanctions, so it's not a panacea, but they have effects. And it would also, in political terms, have been a very kind of weak, self-weakening position of the EU and the West without having imposed these sanction packages. Of course, we live in an interconnected world, so there is. Yeah, but we still are. I mean, there is in a multi-centrist interconnected world. So there is China, and there are other players which are not alternatives but options for Russia to buffer, to survive, to adapt. And kind of in the Cold War, that has been another world. So all in all, I think we have to be realistic, and I think this discussion was a contribution to realism. Please join me in a vivid applause for our discussant, and thank you for your attention.